right. So I'm going to jump in because if you've ever seen one of my presentations, you know that I tend to pack my slides and my presentation. I try to use up every second of our time together, and I don't want to run out of time. So I'm going to dive right in. I first just want to say welcome and thank you for being here. We really appreciated this. This is actually our first public webinar in a while, and we're really excited to be talking about specifically positive marketing, which we'll kind of define and get to in a moment. But I do just want to reiterate that this is hosted and given by HeartSpeak. We're a small organization, but mighty in reach. And I think the best way for our shelter and rescue friends to think of us as really trying to redefine the way that we look at marketing for animal welfare. We're really trying to make the entire process from start to finish much easier, much more turnkey, no matter what your position and set of resources are. I will be sending a copy of the recording of this presentation to everybody afterwards, and I will include in that a little bit more information about HeartSpeak and some resources that I'll talk about throughout the presentation. All right, so first let's talk about what our objectives are today. The first is to really talk about what do we mean when we're saying positive marketing and a positive marketing approach. And then we're going to dive into kind of the nitty-gritty of what makes up a positive marketing approach. And for our purposes today, given that we have limited time together, we're going to talk specifically about the role of imagery and a lot about the role of the language that we use. And by language, we mean both word choice and the way that we are using both our written word and our spoken word to communicate with the larger community. And then we're also going to take a look at what this actually means in practice. So tons of examples from within the field on different topics like fostering, adoption, but also community outreach. So the first thing that I want to do, as I said, is talk about what does this idea of positive marketing mean? And these are probably the most common questions that I get when we talk about positive marketing. So is this a very Pollyanna, sunshine and rainbows approach? Does this mean that you're asking us to ignore the reality of the situation, even when the situation is dire? Does this mean that we're overly sanitizing our message and kind of becoming too slick in the process? And my answer to that is that it's none of these things. And that's really important, I think, for us to get on the same page right from the get-go, that we are not asking you to do any of these things, especially when it comes to kind of ignoring the gravity of a situation or ignoring things like urgency that are really critical to the way that we do our work in this field. But what I do want to kind of talk about is how we're going to define positive marketing. And this comes directly from HeartSpeak. Positive marketing is actually not a term that is used widely in the field of marketing. But for us, it's fairly critical to the way that we're spreading our specific message in animal welfare organizations. So for our purposes today, we're going to talk about this as marketing that uses joy and authenticity as the primary levers for connection. And we're also going to talk about how in that process, we are ultimately building trust through hope and transparency. So those are words that I think will come up again and again. Other buzzwords that I want you to remember around positive marketing are things like compassion and empathy. There is actually one other group that talks a lot about positive marketing, and it is at Fordham University. They have a Center for Positive Marketing. And the way that they define the term is that ultimately it's marketing that is a win-win situation. It does good for both the agency that's doing the marketing and the consumers who are consuming that message. So also think about it in those terms. We are looking for a net benefit for everyone involved. And I think this will make a little bit more sense as we talk about kind of the opposite of positive marketing being this concept of guilt marketing, which we'll get to in a second. So far with me. So again, talking about collective benefit, what we really mean when we're getting into kind of the nitty-gritty of this is that we are looking to offer true and happy connections with both the animals and ultimately with our work. And we know that the work that we do in shelters is nuanced and it's growing ever more so, right, as we make advances in our field. But we also want to be able, through any marketing that we do, to have kind of this law of unintended consequences at stake. And so I want you to think about doing any kind of marketing, whether that's the social posts that you're putting together or the print media that you're putting together or interviews that you're doing with your local media, as delivering a message that the organization cares and respects for both people and pets. And when I say people, I also mean us, the people doing the work. So we ultimately also want to rebrand the way that people are thinking about the work of animal welfare and look at us through a different lens and look at the work that we're doing through a different lens. And I think that ultimately what you'll see is it limits some of that opportunity for what we feel is undeserved criticism, right? And feel free to drop into the chat, but I'm really curious about your personal experience, because how many of you have had that moment where someone says to you, oh, I could never do what you do. It would be too sad, or I'm too emotionally connected to animals to work in a shelter, to volunteer in a shelter. And we know that the truth of the matter is that we do care that much, and we are willing to put up with very emotional work because we care so deeply for what we do. So I want us to look at this opportunity through positive marketing as a way to redefine that conversation that we feel like we're having with the public all the time, right? And I do see a lot of comments in the chat that a lot of you have heard this, right? People either think that you roll around on the floor with puppies and kittens all day, or they think that truly awful things are happening, sometimes at your hands, in sheltering. And we want to be able to really redefine that work that we do, and in the process, redefine the animals that we're serving and the people that we're serving. So I promise after this that my slides get a little bit less wordy. Just this intro section, I think, is that important. And I'm hoping that you'll look at the slides instead of my silly face on the screen. But I want us to also think about marketing as a responsibility. I think too often we are, marketing falls to the bottom of our list, and I know exactly why, right? It is triage most of our lives in sheltering. And so marketing steadily moves its way down the list once the day starts rolling and things come up that are urgent in our day-to-day work. But I also want us to look at marketing as a life-saving tool. And I think that sometimes we look at it as just something to check off the to-do list, when really it can benefit us so much more if we start looking at it from kind of the strengths-based approach. So in that vein of having the responsibility to market, we also have a real kind of call to action for us to look at how any of our messages are affecting anyone who comes across them. So anyone in the public eye who is consuming our messages, ultimately, what are we saying to them, not only in that one packaged message, but about our larger work? What are we telling them in kind of our underlying storytelling about the work that we do, about how much we care, about how much we value the community? In doing so, we also get this opportunity, which I think is exciting, if we can look at it that way, to really dispel myths and stereotypes about, again, the people and animals that we're working with, both internally and externally. And again, I think all of us think of storytelling when we think about marketing, but we have an opportunity to really tell more engaging stories that go beyond adoption, which I think is often just kind of our go-to, is to do adoption marketing. But we do have this larger pool of stories to draw from that allow us to tell bigger stories about the work that we're doing, whether it's in supporting our community or needing their support. And ultimately, part of what is so important about positive marketing, and I think, again, a real strength of this approach, is that it's highly strategic. So when we're looking at kind of those myths of positive marketing, is it sunshine and rainbows? Is it, losing some of the power of our messages? I want to kind of counter that by saying, I think that this is the more strategic approach, when we can look at things through this lens of how is every message that we're putting out there leading back to our bigger goals and our bigger organizational movement in the community. So I would love for you to just drop in the chat, if you don't mind, when I ask about your audience, who is it that you're trying to reach? Who are the first groups of people that come to your mind? Just go ahead and just the very first thing that pops into your head. Donors, adopters, I'm seeing right off the bat, absolutely. People who love pit bulls, I love that. The community, adopters, volunteers. Okay, now my next kind of request to you is think even more specifically, because I think that possibly the best advice that I've ever received in my entire life is that when it comes to marketing, you are never speaking to the general public. And that's usually our answer, is something pretty pretty short and bite-sized. Like we're talking to the general public, we're talking to anybody who loves animals. I want you to drill into that even a little bit more, and think about who is that ideal person that you're trying to reach? Who's the ideal group in the community that you're trying to reach? And then I think to take it one step further, the even more important question that we have to ask ourselves is, who have we likely been missing with our messages? So we often go into this thinking in general terms. We're trying to reach people who have some affinity to animals. And oftentimes we are missing a huge component of people who do fit into that category, but who have never occurred to us as part of our audience. I'm seeing some great answers in the chat. Thank you for participating, y'all. So the reason that I want to ask those questions is that I think the most important thing about marketing is having a good plan and kind of good bones to the structure of what you're talking about. And we're going to veer off now and kind of talk more specifically about positive marketing and get into some more specific stuff about photos and videos and language. But I did want to just stop and take this moment to say, if you are intrigued by this idea of audience, if you want to go a little bit deeper on that, if you want to do some work on establishing what your goals are in marketing and how you can start to kind of pull those levers, I think it's really important that you know that without a clear picture of that, without a very clear picture of who you're trying to reach and what you want to talk to them about. So beyond adoption, what are the other things that you envision the community knowing about your organization? Then it's going to be too easy for you to get lost in your marketing plan. And for our purposes, I would love for you all to visit the Maddie's University Fundamentals of Marketing course. It's a self-guided course, but it will help you kind of get clearer on some of those core pieces of the puzzle that you need to have in place to really take off with positive marketing. So now I'm going to ask for your participation again. I would love for you to just drop into the chat what it is that comes to mind when you see this photo. What are the first things that come to your mind? They can be emotions, they can be really anything that you think of. First words, just drop them right in. Sadness, longing, ASPCA commercial, Sarah McLachlan, get me out, trapped. So I'm just reading off exactly what are you saying? Needs love, sad eyes, heartbroken. Perfect. So when we really analyze this photo, it's just a black and white photo of a really cute puppy behind chain link, right? But there's something that happens when we use color, when we use composition in a photo, when we are trying to kind of pull different emotional levers with people, right? There's a goal with a photo like this, that we are trying to evoke a certain set of emotions in the viewer who's seeing this, right? And for our purposes today, we're going to kind of remember this image as our example of guilt marketing and a guilt appeal. And I wanted to give you kind of the exact definition of what that is, because I think that this is really important for us to pay attention to. So it's a psychological strategy that's used specifically in persuasive marketing. And it's actually classed by marketers as both negative and emotional. And the goal with guilt marketing or guilt appeals is to essentially make the viewer or make the consumer of that message feel such strong kind of guilt-based negative emotions that their only option to assuage those feelings, to get rid of those feelings, is to take action, whatever action you are offering them that will make them feel better about that situation. And I think most of us can kind of reflect on this and say, yes, this has been a go-to of animal welfare marketing, but it's also considered essentially, in this definition, they say it's ubiquitous for charity marketing, meaning it is one and the same. So when people think of charity marketing, they think of guilt appeals. And I think we have a real opportunity, maybe given the moment that we're living in, maybe given a lot of outside context, but I think also given a really special moment that we're experiencing in animal sheltering right now, to really turn the tables on this and make this part of maybe a historical view of how we've done things in our field, but it doesn't need to be our current reality. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about that. So now I would love for you to drop into the chat what this image makes you feel. What are the feelings that you get from this, especially if I give you the context of this is a shelter or rescue animal, this is a shelter or rescue volunteer. So now we're getting love, family, cherished, happier together. And yes, this is Monica Adelsteinson's photo. She is a member of our Artists Helping Animals program. Just really tons of connection is what I'm getting from you in the chat, right? Positive, best friends forever, forever home, he's mine, right? We get all of those same kind of immediate emotional response, but in a totally different direction, right? So when we go through the rest of this presentation today, this is what I want you to think of when we're thinking of positive marketing, right? So we can still make a really important appeal for donations with a photo like this. We can still talk about animals with medical issues with an image like this. We can still talk about all the tough stuff, but there is embedded in this image a really important component that is missing from the first, and it's hope, right? That is the piece of emotional kind of marketing that is missing between these two images. So I would love for you to just kind of keep this in the back of your mind, because we're going to do a little bit deeper dive into guilt marketing, and then we're going to move on to the fun stuff, I promise. So for anybody who is a little bit of a data nerd like myself, and you want a little bit more data behind the decisions that you make, I think that this study is really interesting and really important for us, especially in this moment right now. So this was an analysis of 10,000 articles that were shared across the web. And what they were looking for was, why is it that someone would share an article? What are the emotions that are kind of chosen and associated with that article that made someone say, hey, I want someone else to see this? And awe, laughter, and amusement comprised the majority of reasons that people were sharing an article. Sadness and anger were a very, very small percentage in comparison. And I think we forget that this is true because our current kind of state of affairs on social media is outrage, right? So everybody's looking for the thing that will get them outraged, and our perception is that is why people are sharing, right? And recent information about Facebook algorithm and kind of how they have been handling things over the last few years really points to, yes, there is something in this in terms of the way that these platforms make money that is pushing more provocative comments, more provocative posts. But I think that this is a really important thing for us to hold on to in terms of what it is that really at our core drives us emotionally as human beings. I also want to point out for you that, so I think it is anger that accounts for 6% of this study. And so empathy is also 6%. And empathy is another place where we have a lot of capability and a lot of power in using our messages to make people see that they are not so different from other people, that they can put themselves in someone's shoes who needs help with their pet and their family. And so don't discount that is also a really important emotion that we can kind of draw on here. I want to really quickly talk about, mostly for anybody who has questions, I think the natural question when we start talking about guilt marketing and positive marketing is that, what do we do about fundraising, right? Because guilt marketing has traditionally been used, especially in the fundraising arena. And so what is it that we do to kind of navigate those waters? And I think this is from a study that was done in the 90s, but I think is very, very applicable today to this conversation. And this is one small quote from a much larger study, and I'm happy to share in the follow-up materials all the studies that I talk about. But I think that this is an important piece for us, that as nonprofit professionals, and if you're in a municipal shelter or a government agency, put yourself in that bucket too, just for the purposes of the work that we're doing. We have a duty to accurately and respectfully bring awareness to an issue. And I think that's the piece that is sometimes missing from our guilt appeals, right? We are oversimplifying a pretty complex message. And in that, something about our ultimate goals and mission is being lost. And what I think is being lost sometimes is the most important part of our work that is currently at stake and that is changing. And that is where people fit in to our overall picture, right? We're talking about companion animals. And so ultimately, people are at the core of everything that we do. So keep that kind of in the back of your mind as well. This is another study that I think is way too important to not talk about here. And this is from 2012. So again, a little bit older, but I think just as useful. And in this case, they wanted to look at how individuals who are being advocated for, right, and I'm putting that in air quotes, react to the portrayals of themselves in charity advertisements. And I think this is really valuable for us because ultimately the recipients of our work that are animals don't ever get to give us this feedback, right? They don't ever get to tell us if they would like us to be doing things a different way or trying things a different way and how it's impacting them. We can get that feedback from some of the people that we serve, and that's an important piece of this. But for our purposes here, I really want you to pay attention to the fact that the individuals who participated in the study said the imagery was too simple and utilized overly pitiful images of homeless people, which failed to contribute to any understanding on the issue, right? So, and I think that this makes sense to us logically, and feel free to drop in the chat whether if you agree or if you have more questions. But I think that logically that makes sense, right? If we are oversimplifying and only using a guilt appeal and the imagery and kind of messaging that goes along with that, there's no real understanding happening about human homelessness, about pets who lose their homes, about people and pets who are in crisis, right? That is being thrown out in the wash with a guilt appeal. This is a ton of text on the slide. I'm not going to read all of it, but I think, for those of you that do want to give it a quick scan, I think this is another very important study, and I will include the link to this as well in the follow-up materials. But in this situation, they wanted to look at the fundraising difference between a guilt appeal and an appeal that showed people with disabilities coping positively despite their disability. And what is really important about this is, not surprisingly, like the size of the donations to each campaign were very similar. So they couldn't statistically say that one raised more money than the other. But the really important unintended consequence that happened was that students who were shown the positive video expressed much more positive views in general about people with disabilities in the accompanying survey. And what I think we can take away from that is that just because we raise money on an issue that is using guilt appeal doesn't mean that we've changed hearts and minds, right? It doesn't mean that, it may mean that we can collect money from someone and that they ultimately don't want to live with a pet from the shelter because they still are walking away with the idea that shelter pets are sad or broken or somehow less than, right? Does that kind of make sense to everybody? Feel free to drop into the chat. I think this is a really important thing for us to remember as we're going through this. And I did just want to take one last kind of convincing look at the difference between positive and guilt marketing. And this is really the only study that I am currently aware of from within our field. And this is a case study, not an academic study, but it's from Austin Humane Society from, I think it's 10 years ago now that they did a rebrand of the organization. But really importantly, they undertook in this rebrand a very positive approach that was centered on the relationship between people and pets. So we have posters like this: you scratch, I sniff; you throw, I chase. So very much playing on that relationship between people and pets. And they also, I wanted to make sure that we have a cat one for all of our cat people. They did the same thing with a series of animals. They did them in video, they did them in print, they did them in digital media. And what they saw really soon, within the first year of launching this campaign, was that they were able to double their year-end annual appeal donations, which is huge for all of us, right? We're in October, we're all thinking about these things. They also saw a 13% increase in their overall donations throughout the year. They increased their adoptions by 10%. Depending on the size of your organization, think about increasing adoptions by 10%. That's huge for a lot of us. And importantly, they also increased their volunteer activity by 55,000 hours. That's another huge metric that sometimes we forget about when we're looking at things purely in terms of adoption, right? So that's my final piece on just kind of trying to convince you to give positive marketing a chance. But I want to switch gears again with kind of time in mind to talk about how do we make this happen in our organizations. And for our purposes today, we've broken it into its simplest forms, into imagery and the words that we use, and how we're ultimately going to put those two things together. So first, let's talk about imagery. I want to say that I think, coming from Heartspeak, and our background is in photography, certainly, and essentially rebranding the way that people think and look at shelter animals. This is a huge component for us. So I want you to think about the power that photos and videos have. And whether that is in the digital space, whether we're using Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, or if we are talking about traditional marketing methods, if we're talking about print media, if we're talking about press releases and our relationship with the media, imagery becomes an important part of all of those exercises. And it helps us connect with a broader audience, especially when used strategically and positively, right? So wherever possible, when we're able to choose images that tell an overall story about our organization, to choose images that have inherent in them some of our values as an organization, right? So if my value is connection or compassion or collaboration, I want to be showing that in the photos that I'm using. And this is a perfect example. We also, again, want to dispel myths and stereotypes. And we're able to do this sometimes without using any words, right? When we show pit bull dogs with other dogs, with people, we're pushing back against any stereotypes that exist about them in the community. When we show ear-tipped cats, and our work with doing TNR in the community, or anything that we can tell a subtle story about, we are getting to some of our core messaging, and we're able to break down some of the misinformation that we maybe feel is circulating in the community. We also, again, make ourselves more approachable, which is truly half of the battle and half of what we're talking about when we're talking about marketing, right? We want people to engage with us on a number of levels. You want them to be donors, but you also want them to be volunteers. You want them to be people who will walk into your building and leave with an animal, or who will walk in and say, how can I help you? Or who will walk in and say, I have this special skill set and I would like to be a part of what you're doing because I'm moved by it. Not because they want to save animals from you. And I would love to hear also in the chat if you've had that experience of people. It's one of my pet peeves that we hear in this field sometimes, is that people rescued animals from the shelter, or they saved the animal from the shelter. Because I think that it's a subtle but really important part of the discussion that we are doing this together. We want the community to be our partners in this. And we don't want to be seen as the place where people need to take the animals away from us. We want them to come because they're moved by our work and they're excited about what we're doing. And we also, again, create an investment in the work that we're doing through that effort. So one of the most important things when we're talking about photos, I think, is to not let perfect be the enemy of good. And if you have perfection in mind, I want to give a shout out to, we have a network of over 500 artists, mostly photographers, who volunteer their time in shelters and rescues. We have a spot on our website where you can connect with them. It's called our Find an Artist map. So if you're shooting for just, you really want to amp up images, or you have some long stay pets who really, really need that extra shine on them, then I'm going to kind of direct you there. But I also really want you to feel in your bones this idea of not letting perfect be the enemy of good, right? There is a lot that we can do with our cell phones these days, and there's a lot that that we can overlook. And I included this photo of the kittens in their kennel, in their cage, with a little bit of litter on the floor and a little bit of, stuff going on in the background, because I think that this is so secondary to the central part of this image, which is those adorable faces, right? And same with any of these other photos. I think sometimes we, the photos we're getting from fosters and volunteers aren't ideal, but I want you to consider that in this example from Lifeline, these photos of a pet, of a dog on somebody's lap, living life in a home, are so powerful because we immediately can kind of put ourselves in those person's shoes. We can imagine ourselves having a cup of coffee with this dog. And that ultimately, I would argue, is even more powerful than the most beautiful, clean image that we could get of that dog, because we're shooting for, again, that emotional connection that establishes hope and really amazing feelings of, I want to give this animal a try, or I am actively changing my mind about what I think about shelter and rescue animals, or the work that the shelter does. The first photo here is my favorite illustration of this idea, because it was at one of our photography workshops. They're called a Perfect Exposure Project. And we, in pre-COVID times, did workshops in shelters and invited area rescues and talked about how to use a digital camera more effectively, how to use your cell phone more effectively. And this was at one of those workshops. And this dog we had kind of saved till last. Her name was Snow. And this is in Charleston, South Carolina. Ooh, sorry about that. And we had saved her for last because she was quite shy. And in the shelter, she was not necessarily showing her best self in her kennel. And she had advanced stage heartworm. So you can see her belly is a little distended. And so the goal of marketing her was to get her into a fospice or a hospice adoption situation. And I think that this is a moment that I won't forget, because we were trying to set up, our really nice digital cameras and working on getting a beautiful shot with the leaves blurred out in the background. And when we looked up, she had so connected with this volunteer that she didn't know this volunteer was from a different organization that she had tipped over into her arms and was just so enjoying this moment of just pure love and having somebody give her this attention and soft petting, that there was no need to do anything other than snap a quick cell phone shot of this dog. And we do have beautiful digital DSLR photos that someone took from this day too, but this is a cell phone shot that I think is perfect in that it captured this moment, right? So we could have taken a million other beautiful photos of her, but this moment where she is connecting with this person and kind of showing us and displaying who she is at her core, this dog, right? This is the thing that is going to get somebody to jump in their car and come get her and take her home, knowing that she is not going to have a long life with them, right? And that is ultimately what we're going for. So I want you to kind of touch back when you're going through your images, when you're going through your videos, on that moment. What is the thing that is going to get someone to take action that doesn't need to be overly guilt-ridden, but can instead imply hope, imply potential? The other thing that I would like to appeal to you to do today with your images is to include people in your photos. And that means both asking people to be in your photos and being willing to be in the photo if somebody asks you to. And I know that I think pretty much 100% of us are the folks who go, oh, no, I will just lean out of the photo and you can take the picture of the animal, right? But I want you to think of this as doing your duty for the animals, and in terms of how powerful it is when you can just embrace the connection that you're having with an animal in that moment, and think about the power that you are giving to connection and to storytelling in those moments when you can embrace being in the photo. When we do this, we are, again, breaking down any misinformation that people have about our work and our jobs and the animals that we care for. In this example, this photo is by Rita Earl Blackwell. She's another one of our Artists Helping Animals members. What's really important here is not only that connection between person and pet, but also the fact that we have her badge in the photo, that we now are kind of breaking down any kind of misinformation that people might have about animal services officers or folks that work in animal control or animal services. So we're subtly pushing back against some of those messages. We aren't always saying it overtly, but if we continue to use these kinds of images, if we continue to kind of follow this path of positive marketing, we are consistently showing a different version of reality. And when we are showing and not just telling, it's a lot more powerful. I also wanted to say, for those of us that are a little camera shy, that there are a lot of ways to be in photos, right? So it doesn't always have to be a full-on portrait. We can use elements of humanity in our portraits of animals. In this example, I love having the feet there next to the dog because I immediately can imagine myself sitting there and right on eye level with this dog. I love seeing a hand in a photo, a hand on a head, a hand petting a dog. Any of that I think is incredibly powerful. And really, again, subtle storytelling is happening. And then I wanted to show you kind of this really more diverse set of photos, because I think that we also miss opportunities sometimes to show not just adoption portraits, which are wonderful, but our staff in photos. And what happens when we do that is a couple of different things. We send a message about our work into the community, but we also can use those photos as recruitment tools. I think most of us are experiencing short-staffed organizations right now. What better way to show people that you are a welcoming environment, that you are seeking employees who share these values around people and pets, than to show that that is what's happening in your organization. And so this is just a small sampling, I think, of what is possible when we look at images through this lens. So we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk quite a bit about language, because I think that this is a really, really important how we're pairing the words that we use with our imagery. But let me know if you have any questions in the chat. I saw that I did want to call out that Marlo said that she's a big fan of using over the shoulder shots. That's another great way to incorporate people, but still maintain some anonymous profile of the person in the photo. So when we're talking about language, I want to be clear that we're talking about language in terms of word choice, but also just the general language of animal sheltering, which we'll dive into in a moment. But I want us to also think about the fact that oftentimes our language does not necessarily reflect our thoughts. It reflects habit, and sometimes really bad habits are coming through in our language, right? The things that we feel comfortable saying to each other sometimes make their way into the way that we're speaking to the public. And sometimes we're losing that line of what the public understands, what our community members understand, what even our program recipients understand, versus what we know to be true just because this is work that we do every single day. And it comes out in a multitude of ways that we'll talk about. I think that this is a really important change for us to make within our organizations, to not just talk about language in terms of how we're going to start using it on social media and in our written materials and in our interviews, but also talk about the things that need to change in our internal communication. Because if we can establish new habits about the way that we're talking about people and pets, or the programs that we're offering, it will become a new habit. And we won't have to think so hard about who am I talking to and are they going to understand this or not, because we've already established a new vocabulary for the work that we're doing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But now I'm going to ask for a little bit more participation in the chat. I want to know if you can remember what it was like not to know everything that you take for granted right now. Can you remember a time when you didn't know what TNR meant, or what ringworm was, or what it meant to have a pet whose owner surrendered? Go ahead and drop into the chat if you can remember that, because I think a lot of us have a moment where we're like, I can no longer remember this not being a part of my life every day. And now what I would like for you to do is is to drop into the chat some of the words that immediately pop to mind that you're like, I know exactly what that is, but my best friend who doesn't work in sheltering would never know that, or my husband or my partner or my wife would never know what that was. Go ahead and if it's, I keep going back to TNR because it's the alphabet soup that's in my brain, but there's tons of other ones. So we have return to home, return to owner, foster fail, leash reactive, overstimulated, separation anxiety. Oh yes, distemper shots, kennel stressed, limited admission, resource guarding. These are excellent, guys. Keep going. Community cats, yes. Do not adopt, absolutely. Do not foster. No kill, Kelly, yes. So many of them. And so here's just a smattering, right? That I had some of the same thoughts as you guys, but you've really expanded on this and made it so much better. So even the simplest of terms, right? Someone mentioned foster fail. Someone else mentioned intake, socialization. These are words that we toss around between ourselves, and it is our shared language within this field. But I gotta tell you, even when I started to do this work, it was something that made me feel outside of those that I was working with, to kind of get indoctrinated into sheltering and go like, oh, I'm just going to have to catch on and catch up because nobody's going to tell me what these things mean. I just have to figure it out, right? And I think a lot of us have had that kind of moment. And then I want you to think about how that feels if someone is a volunteer, a brand new volunteer, or brand new foster, or an adopter who is coming in with the best intentions and a lot of excitement, but maybe some trepidation about what it means to adopt a pet. I want you to think about, again, empathy and putting ourselves in the shoes of someone who has never heard these terms before. And what happens when we are kind of insistent about using them is that we immediately are signaling to the people who are consuming that message, whoever our audience is in that moment, that we don't really care enough to bring them along on the journey, that we are okay with keeping them at arm's length and kind of maintaining our position as those who know, and not necessarily taking the time to make sure that they also know, that they also feel welcomed, that they feel served by the work that we're doing because we're taking the time to explain these things to them. And I know that this seems sometimes seems like a very big thing. It seems a little bit overwhelming. And other times seems like, well, that's such a small thing. And it's an attitude change that we need to make. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to still say things that people don't understand. But the first thing that we can do is kind of establish a shared language between ourselves within the organization, right? So sitting down and establishing, here's how we're going to describe return to home. We're going to use home instead of return to owner. We're going to define return to home in this way. Every time we say it, we're going to talk about it in this context. We're going to talk about our live release rate, not as a live release rate, but talk to the public about our data in different terms. And I will send along a document that we have that starts to chip away at this. But again, I don't have all the answers to this. I think this is something that we have to figure out together as an industry. I think that I am excited to have this conversation, and I know a lot of others who are as well. I don't know that any of us have totally cracked the code, but I think that we're ready to figure out how can we establish a new vocabulary for our work. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I think, as usual, I've packed too much into an hour-long presentation. But in terms of what we mean when we talk about language mattering and the fact that we kind of need to hit reset or refresh, the first place to do it is to pop that animal welfare bubble. So anywhere where it's possible, and let's start with one of the simplest places, right? Bios that we're writing. We have a document that I will share with you and a couple of blogs that go into, instead of saying leash reactive, let's learn how to describe that behavior. Let's learn how to show people this dog actually has been in a foster home and loves being with other dogs, but once you put them on a leash, they can, overreact to situations because they're unsure or they're not feeling their most confident. So really breaking things down into, how would you explain this to a friend of yours who is experiencing this behavior or this medical issue, but has none of your knowledge as a sheltering or rescue person? Let's make sure that our language is welcoming and community driven. And part of that is getting rid of jargon. And part of it is the values, again, that we're bringing to that conversation, the voice that we're using as an organization. Do we want to be seen as an organization whose voice is a little bit finger waggy and a little bit, personifying that person in the community? Or do we want to be seen as the voice who is saying, come to us, even if you have a problem, because we want to solve it together? And again, these are very subtle shifts in some cases, but it really is about starting with that plan of how you want to be seen, who are you talking to, and what messages do you want them to hear? When we're talking about language, it's also incredibly important for us to start to think about translated materials and resources. So if you haven't done this yet, and there are other predominant languages besides English spoken in your community, how can you start to work with other local resources, other community organizations, college clubs, if you have colleges or universities in your area? How can you make sure that this is a priority that rises to the top of the list? And then again, building a shared language, one that not only is established on the marketing team or the adoption team, but that gets shared throughout the organization, so that there is knowledge from top to bottom about how you would like to start talking about these things differently. I have two specific examples here, and I apologize for having to go quickly through this section because I think these are important conversations. But in terms of just two call outs that I wanted to make for examples, one is kill shelters. And I think many of us, even within the field, end up using this term for a variety of reasons. And I think I would love to believe that in a lot of cases, it's a bad habit, right, that we have established over time. But I want you to think about how that's not productive for any of us, whether or not your agency calls itself no kill, calls itself socially conscious, calls itself nothing. Being participating in the labeling part of kill shelter and ascribing that either to others or to yourself is highly detrimental to the work that all of us do. This is a great example of language that has eked its way out into the community and we've lost control of it, right? We have the community now coming back to us with this language, and it's hard for us to get that back under control. And what it needs to start with is us modeling not using it between our organizations. It starts a little bit with being brave enough when we hear each other say it to say, hey, we're really trying not to use that term because it's detrimental to all of us. So tell me what you're trying to say. Are you saying that the shelter is full? What is it that you're trying to say right now? And establishing a new habit there. I think the other place that is subtle, but just as important, is this idea of responsible ownership and that we are educating people, right? And doing air quotes again. It's very subjective, the idea of responsible pet ownership. And I think that, again, best intentions were laid when we started to use this language. And oftentimes, I think we know what each other are talking about in context sometimes when we're talking about responsible ownership. But I also want you to think about the power dynamic that happens with some of these language choices. So when we are educating other people, it's immediately establishing a bit of a wall between us and those that we're educating. It's making a value judgment on their knowledge versus ours. And I think that ultimately, in its simplest form, both of these terms keep us from getting down to the issues. It keeps us from being able to do our best work because it keeps people away from us. It keeps them just on the other side of us because they don't want to have these conversations, or they're afraid of being judged, or they're afraid of what work is happening. And these are important places for us to start with making those changes. I want us to move forward I want to jump into some examples before we run out of time and leave a couple minutes for questions. So I'm going to go very quickly through the next 2 slides, but they're really just a reiteration of some of what we talked about already. I want you to really approach the public as our partners and think about them as wanting to help, right? And when we do that, we can immediately establish clear calls to action. We can tell them what we need, how they can support us, how we can do it together, right? Whatever the goal is, whether it's a fundraising goal, whether it is a life-saving goal, we can do it together is the kind of language and attitude that you want to bring to that table. I want to also reiterate from the very beginning of this presentation that honesty, transparency are critical components of this. And we'll see this in some of the examples that we have coming up. I will let you go over this yourself, but this is some of the stuff that I think a lot of us know, but it's always a good reminder that we need to keep the community informed. And the most important kind of sneaky wisdom in this slide is get comfortable repeating yourself. I think sometimes we feel like, well, I already put this message out on social media 2 times, and if we put it out a couple more times, we're bothering people. You're not. They care about the work that you're doing. Only a fraction of them are seeing your message, whether it's coming in it, no matter what format it's coming in. And so you need to get comfortable repeating yourself on different platforms in different ways, but repeat if it's an important message that you want to get across. So I want to, again, switch into some examples. And in this example, I want you to think about the conversations that we have internally that often go something like, this dog is really kennel stressed, or this animal is really stressed in the shelter environment. But I want you to think about how the public consumes a message like that, right? They don't have any of the knowledge that we have. They don't have the nuance of knowing that no matter how big and beautiful we build our shelters, it's always going to be stressful for animals because they're companion animals. They belong with other animals or with other people. There's a social aspect to these animals that will never be met in our environments. That's a hard conversation to have though, right? So it comes down to subtlety. And in this example, the first thing that they start with is empathy. So what you see in this photo, we see. Her face in this photo breaks our hearts. This velvety little hippo is soft, so soft and gentle. All she wants is to nuzzle and cuddle. So we're establishing that we deeply care for her. And then we're going on to say she's still under a year old. She has so much love to give. Come meet her and turn her frown upside down. So we're never saying anywhere in here, she's highly stressed in the kennel environment. We need to get her out ASAP. But there is enough urgency built into this just with her sweet little face and our acknowledgement that she's breaking our hearts, that we still get the same result from very different language. I also want to talk very quickly about known cruelty cases. And the crux of this message is we have to avoid making it personal from our perspective. Because what happens, and I think if we reflect on this, many of us have had this experience, is we end up sliming those animals with the negativity of what happened to them, and it no longer becomes about them. The comments in those threads where we lead with outrage and indignation, the comments become all about that terrible thing or that terrible person, and we're casting blame. And a lot of the conversation is no longer about, hey, can I foster or adopt that animal, right? Those comments are harder to find when we lead with anger and outrage. So keep that in mind in terms of, there's a lot to unpack with this, and I do wish we had a little bit more time with that, but that is a core component of this. Resources, these will be sent to you, but I think some really important places to explore language come from Pets for Life and Adopters Welcome. There's some really important nuances in the language that they're presenting in both of those programs. And now for the examples, and I'm gonna stop myself short in just 3 minutes, so we leave at least 5 minutes for questions. But again, you will get all of these examples, all of these slides, along with the recording. Positive adoption marketing looks like this, and I can't think of a better example than Lifeline Animal Project and both of their shelters. And what I want to call out in this example, specifically this video, is the video is very sweet. It's just of this poor little mangy hippo wagging her tail and sitting on somebody's lap. But what is important here is nowhere in the description do they say mange. So they don't even give themselves that hurdle to climb over. Instead, they describe mange, right? So that's what's going to come down to a lot of our language switches, is instead of saying the word, you're going to describe the word. So it's a non-contagious skin condition that will heal much faster in a low-stress environment like your home. This is another great example. The one for Lois is they're describing a senior dog who doesn't want to live with other dogs. That's the observed behavior that they have in their care. And so they find a really nice way of saying it. She'd prefer someone without other pets because she's really quite the diva. And then they end it with, I'm just a girl standing in front of a family asking them to love her. So the full package of this adoption marketing is that they are marketing these animals as individuals. And that's the big takeaway when it comes to adoption marketing. These are two also amazing, just inspirational examples I'll let you explore on your own. In terms of foster recruitment, I love these two examples. One from Dallas Animal Services when they were trying to get a certain number of dogs into foster so that they could go on an international flight. So they needed to be in foster to essentially quarantine before their flight. I love this use of a passport and very clear communication that they used. And they were not afraid to repeat their message. So every day or so, there was a message about the number of pets who needed their passports, and really kind of pushing to the community that they needed their help to accomplish this. I adore this video from Pima County. So they use the term unicorn home, which I think, or unicorn foster, which I think we've started to use more, but in some cases, we're not explaining what that means. This video does a perfect job of explaining what they mean by a unicorn, that they need kind of a special home and that these are special animals, and that they can really make magic happen by fostering. Case studies for outreach. So these are the places where sometimes we have been using the word educate, and I want you to think about it a little bit differently. So educating about kittens and what to do with them during kitten season, educating about events in your area like fireworks, or in this case, disaster preparedness. And I did want to just make sure that we got to this slide, and then I will open it up for questions. So start to drop your questions either in the Q&A or I'll try to find them in the chat. But I think especially this past year and this past summer in particular, a lot of us have been put in the position of communicating urgency. So full shelters or urgent situations where we really needed the community to step up and be our partners. And if you have not seen this fairly recent video from Humane Society of Harlingen, it is, I think, a perfect example of a very, very simple call to action in the text. And then they let their video, they did a live video that did a lot of heavy lifting for them. So it is their director talking directly to the camera, explaining the situation, taking the time to explain some of the details and the nuance of the situation and what it meant for their shelter. And then they did a live video walkthrough of the shelter so that you were able to connect as the viewer with individual animals, which I think and hope has helped people to really say, okay, I'm going to take action on this. I've received the message, I've seen the animals, I'm going to drive down there and help out. When we're communicating data, a couple of examples of how to do that and be able to do it regularly. So APA does this on a monthly basis. Do what your resources kind of allow you to do. If you're only able to do that bi-monthly or once a year, whatever you can do to start to engage with transparency, I think is important. Positive fundraising. I chose 2 cats with eye issues inadvertently, but they're both really great examples of this effort. And you can take a closer look at them. I love this campaign. And then I did want to provide some examples of kind of the low tech version of this. So not necessarily just digital marketing, but also the way that we're doing some more traditional marketing. I want to make sure I put this up here. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me directly. I will again be in touch with anybody who registered to share the follow-up resources, this recording as well as the slides. And we have a little package of resources and blogs and things that we've referenced in here and that we think will help. Does anybody have any questions? I know I've really cut it to the last minute, but we do have a couple minutes if anybody has anything specific. In the meantime, I will just say a huge thank you. We're really thrilled to have you all here. We're thrilled with the registration numbers, and I'm very honored to be able to talk to you all about this. And we'll be following this up with a series of webinars in the coming months that kind of break down each one of these topics into something a little bit more bite-sized so that we can go a little bit deeper. But I hope that if nothing else, we've all shared a moment that was inspiring. I want to thank the shelters whose examples that I use, because truly they're the ones doing the amazing hard work and I'm just pointing to it. So thank you to all of them. I'm not seeing any questions. I hope that's a good sign. If you think of any in the following hours, minutes, days, just shoot an email our way. And Lisa and I will try to get you an answer. And thank you all again. I think I'm going to leave it here. All right. I hope you all have a great day. Oh, there is one Q&A. How would I recommend getting involved in animal marketing? So I think, Zand, I'm going to go ahead and email me following this because I want to learn a little bit more about your particular situation to give you the best advice possible. But I think 2 great ways to get kind of dip your toe in are asking if you can help out with photos or video, or starting to tackle bio writing, because that's a big barrier for a lot of our organizations, especially when we're running low on time. So those would be my two biggest recommendations, but please feel free to email so that we can do a deeper dive on that topic. And one other question just came in just under the wire, best resource for bio writing for cats needing homes. Linda, we have, if you go to our website, which is heartspeak.org, we have a couple of bio writing toolkits there. And we also link in the follow-up materials to this to some specific resources for cats. And I will be sure to include those. All right, y'all, I'm gonna close it down. Thank you again for your time today and for being here.